everyone, it's Edie, also known as Satella Edie. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I like to post videos about spreading mindfulness and just about certain topics that I enjoy talking about. I'm really excited about this video today because this video is actually a part of a deep dive project for one of my courses called Mental Health and Counseling. In this project, essentially we get to pick any topic where we can do a deep dive research project on any topic we'd like. And for this video, I chose to do a deep dive on how relationships impact our mental health. So I'm really excited to be able to share this with you guys. And yeah, I really hope you guys enjoy this video. I will be focusing my research on 4 different types of relationships: platonic relationships, romantic relationships, familial relationships, and finally, personal relationships, meaning the relationships that we have with ourselves. All sources mentioned in this video that I used to conduct my research will be credited in the bio of this video. Okay, so starting off, we're going to be talking about how platonic relationships impact our personal mental health. I want to start off with a few sources. The article, The Science of Why Friendships Keep Us Healthy, written by Zara Abrams. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. And in this video, if I pronounce any names wrong, I do apologize. So this article is taken from the American Psychological Association, also known as the APA, where this article kind of describes how relationship struggles, or even just the absence of relationships, are actually a common reason why people even just seek therapy, which is evident that platonic relationships does have a big impact on our mental health, because the absence of it is a common reason why people even seek therapy. And further on in this video, I will be discussing romantic relationships, but furthermore in this article, it's described that although romantic relationships are very focused when it comes to mental health, friendships are often overlooked. The value of friendship is underestimated, and research in psychology shows that having solid, supportive friendships plays a vital role in our health and actually how long we live. So this is really interesting, is that this article describes how people who have close platonic friendships and just those kind of platonic relationships in general have a reduced risk of death from various causes, including heart disease and other long-term health conditions. So evidently, our platonic friendships and the platonic connections we make with others correlates with a longer lifespan, which I found to be really interesting. So yeah, it's just something to remember, that keep your friends close because they're really healthy to have in your life. Furthermore, this article also discusses a review of 38 studies that was conducted in this research, which found that adult friendships, especially high quality functioning ones that provide social support and companionship, significantly predict well-being and can protect against mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, and they are overall just beneficial across the lifespan, as mentioned before. So with talking about reducing premature death, it is evident that having high quality, close platonic friendships are not only just beneficial to our mental health, but they have lifelong lasting benefits. Additionally, friendships also protect us emotionally by changing the way we respond to stress. For example, if you're going through a hard time, you might go to your friend for some advice, and therefore that may have a beneficial impact on your mental health, knowing that you're not alone, having a supportive figure in your life. Evidence to back this up was that participants in this study described in this article were given a friend alongside them while completing a difficult task, and they found that the ones that had a companion on their side had less heart rate reactivity than those who were working alone. Another factor for social isolation is social media. Now, this is kind of contradictory because you think, oh, social media is an easy way for us to access friendships, create more friends, just really expand our social circle. However, social disconnection is a huge outcome from social media. It's rising across all age groups, and according to this article, it appears to have worsened after 2012 when smartphones and social media became virtually more popular. So the question is, why? Wouldn't we think that social media would help us expand social connection and just overall platonic connection with other people? Well, the truth is, while it still does that, and it's easy to just shoot a text to your friend in an issue, it also causes us to have less face-to-face interaction, which is essential to the positive benefits of our friendships. Even if there's no physical component of your friendships, it's important to be in person and communicating with your friends because, in my personal opinion, maybe it could backfire, and that's a reason why social media could be a bit damaging because, for example, say that you're in a friend group and they're posting online and they maybe not purposefully didn't invite you to something, and therefore that may have a negative impact on your mental health. So it's just those kind of things. That's just an example, especially for younger age groups. Particularly, you see that a lot. I know that I've seen, especially with the rising of live streaming and having access to that when you're in middle school seems to be a bit problematic, but that's a topic we can discuss on a later date. I still have some more sources for platonic relationships I want to get into. So another source that I want to talk about when talking about platonic relationships and how they impact our mental health is an article called Mental Health Disorders and Adolescent Peer Relationships, written by Emily Long, Maria Gardani, Mark McCann, Helen Sweeting, Martin Tranmer, and Lawrence Moore. The rationale of this article describes how important peer relationships are during adolescence. This study discussed in this article applies innovative social network methods to explore how disruptive behavior and anxiety disorders relate to teen friendships specifically. So this source is targeted towards those adolescent friendships. Although in each of these topics, it's kind of just a variety of the age groups. This one specifically focuses on adolescent friendships, which I found quite interesting and I wanted to include in this video. The highlights taken from this study is that peer relationships are associated with mental health disorders during adolescence, as one could predict. Adolescents with disruptive behavior disorders actually experience increased peer popularity, which is quite interesting in my opinion. Maybe, for example, that could be if you see bullying and people being rewarded for that in an adolescent setting. So I found that quite interesting and I want to share that with you guys. And finally, anxiety disorders are not related to adolescent social connections, which I also kind of found interesting because if somebody has social anxiety, they could have a harder time making those social connections, which can be evident in some cases, but in this specific study, they didn't find that. So take that with you will, but I found that quite interesting. However, that does not apply to every situation, and there's many situations where if a teenager were to experience social anxiety, that would probably hinder their connections with others. So the conclusions from this study suggest that disruptive behavior disorders may be socially rewarded, such as peer popularity, whereas anxiety disorders do not show much trends. So kind of what I described before, anxiety disorders wasn't really correlated in the study, but that's just a study. Specifically, I found it interesting, but as I mentioned before, that's not the case for every single adolescent. This is just one study. So yeah. The last source I want to discuss on platonic relationships is a journal called Effects of Personal Relationships on Physical and Mental Health Among Young Adults, written by, I think I'm just gonna put it up on the screen because I'm not really sure how to pronounce these names. And this journal was published on Science Direct. So this scoping review examines how personal relationships of young adults are connected to their physical and mental health. So this is kind of like adolescence and emerging adulthood. I wanted to add this journal because the findings of this scoping review revealed that supportive friendships, along with the characteristics and quality of those friendships, can positively influence young adults' self-esteem and mental health and overall well-being. So kind of just a summary of everything that we've talked about. It's evident that throughout not only just doing my research, but with my own knowledge as well, I think that it's a pretty positive correlation between having good friends and good well-being. Very important to us, and it's important to keep those friendships. Some of my other videos, I talk about communication a little bit, and I want to discuss that more in future videos, but just remember to keep those positive relationships in your lives. Communication is not only key, but also comprehension. So overall, always make sure you're showing support and love to those platonic friendships and relationships in your life because they mean a lot more than you'd think. Okay, you guys, so I forgot to add this in the video, but I did recently learn about this in my sex relationships communication class, and I wanted to add it to this video since it does relate to friendships. So one of the things that was really interesting that I'd recently learned was that friendships differ from obviously the other types of close relationships that we talked about. But what I really found interesting is how they are not only voluntary, but the reason why they're so different from those romantic relationships is because they lack the pressures associated with those romantic relationships. They're non-exclusive, and they also have these different types of functions. So, for example, we know that friends offer a sense of inclusiveness and belonging. Friends offer that kind of emotional support, or any kind of support, kind of that I mentioned earlier in this video. Friends provide opportunities for different kinds of communication and kind of that advice, you know what I mean? And finally, our friends reinforce our identity. I mean, we're more likely to be friends with people who share similar interests to us. So, yeah. Alright guys, and I just wanted to show you guys a real life example of two amazing supportive friends. Yay! Okay, so now let's dive into how romantic relationships impact our mental health. So as I mentioned sort of in the beginning of this video, it's evident that a lot of people, when they think of relationships and mental health, they automatically assume to romantic relationships. Now, I'm not saying everyone thinks that, but most of the time, because romantic relationships are closer connections we have with people. It's when two people unite and decide to share this special kind of relationships that is a bit deeper than a friendship on a romantic level. This can also have a very big impact on our mental health, but don't forget those pure platonic relationships can as well. I want to start off with this source. It's a research journal called Mental Health and Satisfaction with Partners, and it focuses on a longitudinal analysis in the UK specifically. So I wanted to add this in because I feel like it's important to just look at some studies on a more global perspective in different locations as well. This research journal is published by Paul Downward, Simone Rascute, and Harish Kumar. Once again, if I'm pronouncing them wrong, all sources are credited in the bio as well. And if I don't know how to pronounce it, then I will just put it on the screen. Anyways, this was posted on BMC Psychology. And basically, this paper investigates how link between mental health and partner satisfaction in specifically the UK. It finds that poor mental health is generally linked to lower relationship satisfaction. So, I mean, I think that's not very surprising. Obviously, if you get in a fight with your partner, you're gonna be a little bit mentally distraught for a bit. Even with breakups, obviously that has a big impact on our mental health. So that's not too surprising. However, I found this quite interesting. There's some casual evidence here suggesting that for men in particular, declining mental health may lead to reduced satisfaction with their partners. So my personal kind of intake here with this study in the UK stating that declining mental health with men will reduce their relationship satisfaction. I don't think that's too surprising, but I think that could actually correlate with some stereotypes in society, how men can be expected to hide their mental health and their feelings, which will obviously, I mean, I think for anyone, I don't really think it matters on whatever your gender is, but maybe my guess here, it really targets men because they're kind of expected, not expected, but in society in the past, they've been expected to suppress their feelings, which may come out in other forms, such as reduced relationship satisfaction. But that also, like I said, could really go for anyone. I don't think it really matters on your gender, but my guess on why they found that in the UK may relate to those gender stereotypes. It's also evident that relationships can offset loneliness. What that I also pulled from this research journal is that, quote, relationships can offset loneliness and provide a basis for enjoyable, shared social interactions and emotional pleasure, which is more likely to be the case with attachment relationships. So this is really interesting because attachment in relationships is a whole other discussion, but it's essential. I mean, when we're in a relationship, we're close and intimate with someone, we're ideally gonna be attached, and that can have good, positive, enjoyable, shared social interactions, just as this article states, but also, I think it's important to keep in mind, that can also be negative. If we're really attached to someone, we may forget to take care of ourselves too. And this is where I'm kind of coming in with my own commentary, but I think that it's really important to keep that attachment balanced. I don't think attachment is necessarily negative because it is inevitable, especially in romantic relationships, but make sure that you're prioritizing yourself and you're prioritizing your partner's personal space. I could really discuss the different kinds of attachment styles that would really impact these kind of relationships, but I'm not really gonna get into that in this video. If you guys would be interested in me discussing the different attachment styles and how it could impact certain relationships, then comment down below, let me know. So overall, the results of this UK study was that lower mental health is associated with lower satisfaction with partners, which we said was not too surprising. And the overall discussion from this study was that for females, relationship satisfaction is more likely to influence mental health, and for males, there's more of a potential back and forth between relationship satisfaction and mental health. So I told you guys my theory, and I'd be interested to hear yours about this UK study. So okay, let's get into the more general stuff about romantic relationships. So I have another source here. It is a research article called Emotional Well-Being as a Matter of Relationships and Love: Insights for Social Work from Mental Health Peer, Mentor, Trainees, Carriers, and Practitioners. This research article is written by Diane Ross, Mary Kush, John Conley, and Blindy Bennett, and it was accessed on Taylor and Francis online. So essentially, this article defines well-being as, quote, being difficult to define due to divergent ways in which individuals comprehend well-being in their differing contexts. Research abstract of this article is, quote, emotional well-being was understood as a fluctuating continuum of capacities to engage in everyday activities, to self-care, and to foster relationships with others, kind of what we were talking about earlier. The absence of emotional well-being was linked to reduced quality of relationships and the ability to love. So what does this mean? In my personal understanding, this means that if we don't have that well-being with ourselves, that emotional well-being within ourselves, that emotional stability and that self-care we provide to ourselves, then we're less likely to have those satisfying, specifically romantic relationships and love kind of here. Now, love could be platonic, but I'm just talking about romance here, but I think this could also be applicable for platonic relationships. It's just really important to make sure that you take care of yourself before you are able to love someone, because if you don't have that emotional well-being with yourself first, then that will hinder your ability to love someone else. This will also kind of connect to the personal relationships I will be discussing later on in this video. Okay, and one last source for how romantic relationships impact our mental health. I wanted to share more about the journal that I shared earlier that was the effects of personal relationships on physical and mental health among young adults specifically. This source is going to come up a few times because I found some really interesting stuff here. In the scoping review, additionally explores the association between young adults' personal relationships and their physical and mental health. Now, we kind of talked about that with the platonic relationships, but here we're going to be focusing on those romantic relationships. The reviewed studies that was examined focused on studies that access both the nature and quality of interactions within these personal relationships and how they influence that overall well-being. The results of the study indicated that individuals' relationship status and psychological social dynamics within those relationships can significantly impact those young adults' mental health, which kind of was described before. Although this journal did describe how those aspects also impact those platonic relationships, but here, even in those personal romantic relationships, which makes sense because if you're having a conflict with a friend, as mentioned before, or with your romantic partner, it's going to impact your mental health. So just make sure that you're understanding of each other, because that comprehension component is really important when it comes to communication in those personal relationships. And, you know, talking to those close friends if you're having an issue with your partner isn't necessarily harmful, but make sure you're careful with who you do, because it's never really good to get a third party involved in your relationship. And if you just need advice, try to keep it non-biased, because we don't need to make anyone feel bad or cause any more mental health issues for you or your partner. So just be mindful of that, because I think that's an easy tactic that people go to, but I would try to discuss with your partner first when you have an issue and not just directly go to those platonic friends. Although those platonic friends can be very helpful, if you're having your own mental health issues, try not to blame those on your partner. All right, so let's move on to how familial relationships impact our mental health. So familial, I mean family relationships, right? Those relationships that we are born into, depending on your situation, of course. The journal that I just mentioned before that I said is going to come up a few times, I will be mentioning here again, which was the effects of personal relationships on physical and mental health among young adults specifically. So the results of this study also found that the quality of relationships with family members, such as parents, siblings, and extended family, are significantly also associated with well-being, which also makes sense. So it kind of makes sense that this source kind of correlates with all three of these different types of relationships I mentioned so far, because they all are associated with our well-being. If we have good friends, good well-being. If we have a satisfying romantic relationship, good well-being. If we have satisfying close relationships with our family members, good well-being. So it kind of makes sense here, but I thought it was important to bring in some backed up research evidence here. The news source that we're going to be discussing for familial bonds and how it impacts our mental health is an article written by Chen and Kathleen Mullen-Harris, posted on JAMA Networks, which is called Association of Positive Family Relationships with Mental Health Trajectories from Adolescence to Midlife. So this study took a cohort of 18,185 individuals, so specifically 9,233 females and 8,952 males. Who experienced positive adolescent family relationships. Furthermore, those who had experienced positive adolescent family relationships had significantly lower levels of depressive symptoms from early adolescence to midlife. So midlife, such as late 30s to early 40s, in comparison to those who had less positive family relationships where they had more depressive symptoms, which makes sense. The meaning of the findings in this study suggests, quote, an association of early intervention in family relationships during adolescence with better mental health into adulthood and midlife. So yeah, there is that association there. Overall, it is important to foster these positive familial relationships during adolescence, evident through this correlation with a reduction of depression in adulthood. It is really associated with our well-being, and especially in those adolescent years, they're actually vital, even though there may be more tension between family because teenagers are going through some phases. So yeah, but it is important, and you can find those with other people as well, in my personal opinion. But those familial bonds are important, especially in those adolescent years. I mean, it makes sense. We need someone to look up to become a young adult. So yeah, but that's not always the case, and it can also be very different for some people. This study really only focuses on those family relationships, but family can be made of anyone, in my opinion. Finally, for our relationships with ourselves, this is so vital because honestly, in my opinion, and I mean in most cases, our personal relationships with ourselves is going to influence all the relationships I discussed in this video so far: platonic, romantic, and familial. It can also be argued that those platonic, romantic, and familial relationships will also impact our personal relationships with ourselves. That's why it is so important to have that personal relationship established with yourself before you build even stronger relationships with others, because you have to make sure that you got your own back. Okay, so for this one, I'm only going to be discussing the source that I've mentioned quite a few times now, which is effects of personal relationships on physical and mental health among young adults. I'm going to be referencing this journal again. So as mentioned before, this scoping review did analysis on how personal relationships with other people can really impact our mental health and well-being, and the results showed that, quote, quality of these personal relationships could support young adult self-esteem, mental health, and well-being. These personal relationships are important with enhancing young adult self-esteem, mental health, all those things that were already mentioned. So this journal also found that a few studies show that personal relationships affect those cortisol levels, which makes sense. So cortisol levels impact, they're kind of like the stress hormone, which makes sense. According to this article, quote, late adolescence and young adulthood is a period where they begin to be more autonomous, individuating from parents and gaining autonomy and being able to make responsible decisions for oneself, which is significant for oneself, are significant developmental needs during late adolescence. When parents exert greater parental authority, too much emotional support and psychological control might hinder a younger adult's developmental needs and adversity, which may affect their mental health and development. So that kind of specifically goes into more how those familial bonds affect that in the adolescent years with their personal relationship with themselves, kind of just hindering their own mental health. So how does our relationship with ourselves impact our mental health? Well, I mean, if we have a positive view on ourselves, depending on how we talk to ourselves, we're gonna have a more satisfying mental health. But if we have lower self-esteem, we don't feel as good about ourselves, then we're gonna have more of a declining mental health there. Ways that I would recommend to establish a stronger relationship with yourself is just really, sitting with yourself maybe once a day or whatever time you may have within your schedule, just to really think, okay, how am I feeling? How am I doing? And just checking in on yourself. Some people do that through journaling. Personally, I meditate. Just a moment with yourself to really understand how am I feeling and really just create that emotional personal bond within yourself where you can really assess your feelings, because it's easy to fall down a rabbit hole of I don't know how I feel, and that's when insecurities within ourselves develop, and then we kind of project those on those other important relationships that I've mentioned in this video. So it's really important, like I said, and like I keep saying, to have that strong relationship with yourselves. And there's many sources where you can access that. So now that we've covered how all these different types of relationships impact our mental health, I would like to discuss a few theories that are applicable to the three forms of the relationships discussed in this video. So that's platonic, romantic, and familial, relate to our mental health. So the article, The Social Route to Mental Health, a systematic review and synthesis of theories linking social relationships to mental health to inform interventions, written by, and I'm just gonna put the names on the screen because there's a lot there, was posted on the Science Direct. And the aim of the study was to, quote, systematically review and synthesize theories linking social relationships to mental health to extract key theoretical assumptions to explain how social relationships influence mental health and how the social circumstances that distinguish beneficial social relationships from relationships that have no effects or cause harm. So the theories may overlap here, but with all the theories that this article explored linking to these relationships and mental health, they all relate to the positive influence of social relationships on mental health, or at least that's what I'm focusing on here. Taken from the article, quote, the systematic search identified 6 theories that explained the influence of social relationships on mental health, and I'm gonna list those out now. So number 1 was the social support and buffering theory. This theory kind of talks about how support and the provision of support in general really sustains those beneficial effects of those social relationships, and how social relationships influence mental health and well-being through just different types of those social support that are given through relationships. The next theory is the need to belong theory that describes, quote, humans are driven by a basic need for belongingness to form and maintain those interpersonal relationships with others. Overall, this theory states how these relationships influence mental health and well-being through their potential to fulfill the fundamental need for belongingness and connection. The third theory discussed is the adult attachment theory, which, quote, highlights the function of attachment relationships in adult life as an important mechanism through which social relationships affect mental health. So this theory relates to the 4 adult attachment styles, which is the secure attachment style, anxious preoccupied attachment style, dismissive avoidant attachment style, and the fearful avoidant, and how those attachment styles that we develop in our adulthood really do impact the mental health of our social relationships, which makes sense because for example, I'm not going to really go into depth about the adult attachment styles, but if you have a preoccupied attachment style, which is when you really feel the need to be in for example, a romantic relationship to feel sustained and fulfilled, you're going to get into these quick, relationships that aren't really going to stay around, and you're going to feel more insecure, and that's going to impact not only just the relationships, those romantic relationships you have, but it's also going to impact your own personal mental health as to you feeling insecure, which relates actually to your personal relationship with yourself. So the 4th theory is the social cure approach. So this one describes, quote, group memberships, given that they provide members with positive social identities, have the power to act as social cures because they provide people with psychological resources such as a sense of connectedness, common direction, meaning, purpose, and worth, social support, and collective efficiency, agency, and power. What does this mean? This means that group settings are really beneficial to mental health because they provide individuals with social identities that unlock psychological resources and, you know, mental health. So the social identities, how we interact with others, that's going to impact our mental health. The fifth theory is thriving through relationships theory, which, quote, focuses on the interpersonal dyadic process by which close social relationships affect people's thriving through their provision of social support. So this means those close personal relationships in social relationships, right, impact our well-being by providing two specific support functions in two life contexts. In turn, this overall contributes to the long-term thriving of the individual. Thriving in those relationships is going to impact our mental health. And finally, the sixth theory, relational regulation theory, also abbreviated as RRT. Quote, explains how the beneficial effect of perceived social support on mental health is rooted in social interactions. So this means that social relationships are beneficial to mental health because they enable people to regulate their thoughts and actions through the ordinary day-to-day conversations and activities with other people. So it's just that regulation of interacting with others and how that impacts our mental health. Okay, everyone, so that concludes today's video on me discussing how these different types of relationships impact our mental health. If you guys want me to go into more detail or anything like that, and if this video really interested you, please comment down below and share your thoughts and ideas on this topic. I also would love to hear any video suggestions or recommendations that you'd like to see in the future. And yeah, like I said, I love seeing different types of perspectives and your thoughts on what was discussed in today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!